Charles Spencer, the 9th Earl Spencer, brother to the late Princess of Wales, and lifelong guardian of the Spencer legacy, just stunned the entire United Kingdom by finally breaking a silence he had held for 27 agonizing years, shattering a solemn oath sworn upon his sister's coffin in September of 1997. An oath he had guarded with the ferocity of a wounded lion until a catastrophic event only 3 nights ago finally forced his trembling hand. Standing behind the ancient mahogany desk in the cavernous, hauntingly quiet library of Althorp House, with the cream-colored envelope trembling between his fingers and the wax seal still unbroken after more than a quarter of a century, the 9th Earl looked directly into the camera lens with the weight of an entire dynasty pressing down upon his shoulders, and in that suffocating moment, 20 million viewers across the world felt the temperature of history itself drop. What exactly did Diana secretly leave behind for the woman she once called her rival, sealed inside a letter never meant to be opened until now? Why did the Princess of Wales explicitly forbid her brother from delivering this envelope until a very specific condition had been met? A condition finally triggered just 72 hours ago? And what dark, hidden tragedy involving a shadowy senior courtier operating from within the very machinery of the palace finally compelled Charles Spencer to shatter the sacred vow he had guarded for over 2 devastating decades? The morning had broken pale and biting across the Northamptonshire estate, a thin frost coating the ancient stone balustrades of Althorp, the pale November light filtering through the tall mullioned windows of the private library in long, dust-laden shafts. Outside, the grounds lay silent, the great oaks stripped bare, the ornamental lake frost covered and still. Inside, the fire in the enormous marble hearth crackled low, throwing amber shadows across the crimson Persian rugs and the towering shelves of leather-bound Spencer histories, some volumes dating back to the 16th century. Above the mantel, a Van Dyck portrait of a long-dead Spencer ancestor gazed down with cold, aristocratic composure, as though bearing silent witness to what was about to unfold. Dust motes danced lazily in the shafts of light, the grandfather clock in the far corner ticking with the deliberate, unhurried rhythm of centuries. And on the mahogany desk, resting upon a square of black velvet, sat the object of mystery that had haunted Charles Spencer for 27 years, a cream-colored envelope, the paper faded to the color of aged ivory, its corners softened by time. Sealed with a disc of deep crimson wax bearing the unmistakable imprint of the Spencer swallow crest, and beneath the crest, in Diana's own unmistakable looping hand, 3 words written in faded blue ink: for Camilla. Private, the 9th Earl drew a slow breath, his knuckles white against the polished wood of the desk, and when he finally spoke, his voice was growly, weighted, trembling on the edge of an emotion he had suppressed for nearly 3 decades. For 27 years, he said, addressing the camera directly, the world has spoken for my sister. The palace has spoken for her. The press has spoken for her. Even those who despised her have claimed her voice. Today, I am speaking for her. And more importantly today, at long last, she is speaking for herself. Behind the cameras, the producer, a veteran BBC broadcaster named Alistair Gray, wiped a bead of sweat from his temple with a trembling hand, his eyes flicking nervously toward the encrypted satellite uplink monitor mounted on the far wall. Twice already in the past hour, Palace Communications had attempted to interfere with the feed. Twice already, coded requests had been relayed through Buckingham's press office demanding the broadcast be delayed, rescheduled, reviewed. Twice already, the 9th Earl had refused. The signal was holding. 20 million screens across the United Kingdom, across the Commonwealth, across the Atlantic, were locked. And now, at last, the Earl reached for the envelope. He paused, his fingers hovering above the crimson wax, and a memory rose unbidden. August of 1997, only weeks before Paris. Diana had come to Althorp for a private weekend, her sons at Balmoral with their father, the summer light golden through the same tall windows of this very library. She had been quieter than usual, her aquamarine eyes shadowed with a knowing he had not understood at the time. They had walked together across the grounds, the scent of white gardenias heavy in the warm air, and she had stopped beside the lake, turning to him with a small, sad smile. "Charles," she had said softly, her voice carrying that peculiar rhythm he would remember for the rest of his life. "If anything happens to me, anything at all, there is a letter I need you to keep. Not to open." Not to read, to keep. And one day, when the men in gray finally show their hand, you will know when to deliver it. He had laughed then, dismissing her words as one of her strange premonitions, the melancholy that sometimes seized her in those final months. He had laughed. And he had not laughed since. The wax seal cracked. The sound was small, almost delicate in the vast quiet of the library. But to the 20 million watching, it carried the weight of a cathedral bell tolling at midnight. Across pubs in Edinburgh, pint glasses froze mid-air. In living rooms across Cornwall and Cardiff and Belfast, families leaned forward. In Kensington and Chelsea, the discreet clatter of teacups fell silent. Millions of screens flickered simultaneously as the encrypted feed pulsed once, twice, then held. Charles Spencer eased the flap open with the care of a man handling a religious relic, and from within the envelope he withdrew 3 folded sheets of cream-colored stationery, each embossed at the top with Diana's personal cipher. His hands trembled. He set the pages upon the black velvet, and before he read a single word, he lifted his gaze once more to the camera. "Before I read what my sister wrote," he said, his voice cracking, "you must understand why she chose Camilla, and you must understand who she chose against." He paused, and in the pause, the entire nation held its breath. The man had been operating within the corridors of the palace since the late 1970s. He had never held a title of nobility. He had never sat within earshot of a throne. He had never appeared in a photograph beside a monarch. And yet, for over 4 decades, his charcoal suits, his polished Oxford shoes, his cold gray eyes, and his ever-present leather clipboard had shaped every significant decision passing through the private secretariats of 3 separate royal households. His name would never be spoken in this broadcast. Legal counsel had advised against it, and the 9th Earl had reluctantly agreed, but his role would be exposed with forensic precision. He was the senior courtier, the invisible architect, the man Diana herself had christened in her private diaries as the Grey Cardinal. He had been the true engineer of her isolation in the final years of her marriage. He had been the strategist behind the campaign that painted her as unstable, hysterical, unfit. He had been the one who quietly authorized the removal of her royal protection detail in the summer of 1996. He had been the one who ensured that on the night of August 31st, 1997, in a certain tunnel beneath the Place de l'Alma in Paris, a series of security decisions had been made and unmade with the calculated, ruthless machinery of an institution protecting itself. And he was, at this very moment, still walking the corridors of Buckingham Palace, still holding his clipboard, still whispering into the ears of men who bore crowns. Charles Spencer lifted the first page. "My darling Camilla," he read, and across the United Kingdom, a collective gasp rose from 20 million throats. "If you are reading this letter, then I am gone, and the man we both know, the man in the charcoal suit, who has spent his life pulling the strings of both our lives, has finally overplayed his hand. I have written this letter because there is no one else in the world who will understand what I am about to tell you. Not William, not Harry, not Charles, not even my own brother, who will deliver this to you when the time is right. Only you. Because only you know what it is to be devoured by the same machine that devoured me." The 9th Earl's voice faltered. He steadied himself, drew breath, and continued. The words that followed obliterated every assumption the world had held about the relationship between the 2 women for over 3 decades. Diana had known. She had known for years from the very beginning, even that Camilla Parker Bowles had not been the calculating rival the tabloids painted her to be. Diana had known that Camilla, too, had been maneuvered, positioned, and used by the same shadowy architect who had orchestrated Diana's own destruction. She wrote of a private meeting, arranged in secret, at a small country house in Gloucestershire in the spring of 1995. She and Camilla had sat together for 3 hours, over cold tea gone forgotten, and had spoken with an honesty neither of them had ever imagined possible. And what they had discovered had chilled them both to the marrow of their bones. Charles Spencer paused, laid the first page aside, and reached beneath the desk. There was the soft, mechanical click of a hidden compartment releasing a false bottom drawer built into the mahogany decades ago by their father, the 8th Earl, and from within it, the 9th Earl withdrew a second object. A small silver cassette tape, its label yellowed with age, bearing in Diana's handwriting a single date, 14th April, 1995. He held it up to the camera. "This," he said, is the recording of that meeting. Diana kept it as a fail-safe. Camilla did not know it existed. Neither did anyone else. It has been authenticated by 3 independent forensic audio experts, 2 of them former MI6 signals technicians. The voice prints are a biometric match. The magnetic decay patterns confirm the date. What you are about to hear is real. He slotted the cassette into an antique reel-to-reel player that had been waiting on the side table, and after a brief hiss of static, 2 voices emerged into the vast quiet of the library. Diana's voice, unmistakable, low, urgent, and Camilla's, softer, weary, edged with something that sounded very much like fear. The recording was only 4 minutes long, but in those 4 minutes, the entire narrative of the House of Windsor's most infamous love triangle collapsed in on itself. The 2 women spoke not as rivals, but as 2 hunted animals comparing the scars of the same trap. They named the Grey Cardinal. They named the dates. They named the specific decisions he had made to keep them at each other's throats, to keep the public focused on their supposed feud, so that no one would ever look up long enough to see the true architect of the House of Windsor's descent into scandal. The recording ended. The library was so silent that the ticking of the grandfather clock sounded like hammer blows. And then, without warning, the antique rotary telephone on the mahogany desk began to ring. Charles Spencer flinched. Alistair Gray, the producer, went rigid behind the cameras. The ringing continued old, brassy, insistent, and after the 3rd ring, the 9th Earl lifted the receiver with hands that had gone bloodless. "Althorpe," he said quietly. And for a long moment, there was only silence on the other end. Then a voice stripped of every ounce of sovereign authority. A voice reduced to the broken sob of a 15-year-old boy standing on a gravel drive at Balmoral in September of 1997, spoke his name. "Uncle Charles." It was William. "Uncle Charles, is it true? Is any of it true?" The 9th Earl closed his eyes. "Yes, William," he said, his voice cracking. "All of it. Every word." There was a long pause, and then the sound of William drawing a shuddering breath. "Then finish it," the future king said. "Read the rest. For her. For all of us. Finish it." And the line went dead. Charles Spencer set the receiver down. The library was still. 20 million people were watching live. Servers were holding. The nation held its breath. And the 9th Earl lifted the 2nd page of Diana's letter. The Princess of Wales had written of a night in September of 1992, only weeks before her formal separation from the Prince of Wales was announced. She had been at Kensington Palace, alone, the boys asleep in the nursery, when the Grey Cardinal had come to see her without appointment. Without warning, at nearly 11 in the evening, he had stood in her private drawing room in his charcoal suit and his polished Oxford shoes, his clipboard tucked beneath one arm, and he had delivered to her, with the cold precision of a surgeon reciting a diagnosis, a list of what he called her operational parameters going forward. She was to say nothing to the press. She was to appear at every function she was instructed to appear at. She was to smile. She was to endure. And if she deviated from these parameters, he had said, in that voice as flat and gray as his suit, there would be consequences she was not equipped to imagine. She had asked him what he meant. He had smiled a small, terrifying, bloodless smile, and he had said only this, Princess, the institution has survived kings who lost their heads. It will certainly survive a woman who forgot her place. Diana had written those words down that very night, and she had written them again, in this letter, for Camilla to read after her death. Because Camilla, she wrote, had received an almost identical visit in the winter of 1994. The same charcoal suit, the same polished Oxford shoes, the same clipboard, the same terrifying smile, the same warning. Charles Spencer turned the page. Outside the library windows, a sudden wind rose across the Althorpe grounds, rattling the ancient panes, and somewhere in the distance, the estate's chapel bell chimed once a single, mournful note that seemed to acknowledge the gravity of what was being unearthed. The 9th Earl continued. Diana had written of Paris. Not the accident. She could not, of course, have written of the accident before it happened, but of her fears in the weeks leading up to that August. She had written that the Grey Cardinal had summoned her to a meeting at St. James's Palace in early July of 1997, and that in that meeting, he had suggested with the same bloodless smile that her recent behavior with Dodi Fayed was creating what he called an untenable diplomatic complication. He had told her that her security arrangements would need to be reviewed. He had told her that certain protections she had previously enjoyed might no longer be available in certain foreign jurisdictions. He had told her, in essence, that the institution could no longer guarantee her safety if she continued down her current path. And Diana had written, in this letter to Camilla, that she had known in that moment, known with a mathematical, terrifying clarity that a decision had been made about her, that the trap had been set, that she was cornered, she was terrified. But she had written this letter anyway, because if the worst happened, she wanted Camilla to know. She wanted the woman the world had cast as her rival to understand that Diana did not blame her, that Diana had in fact come to see Camilla as a fellow prisoner, and that Diana was asking Camilla, in the event of her death, to do one thing, one single sacred thing that only Camilla could do. Charles Spencer paused. He looked up at the camera. His eyes were wet. "My sister," he said, his voice growly and cracked, asked Camilla to protect her boys, to protect William and Harry from the same machinery that had destroyed her, to use her position, the position she would one day hold, to shield them from the Grey Cardinal and every man like him. My sister asked her rival to become the mother she could no longer be. And Camilla, he paused, drawing a shuddering breath. Camilla did not know. Camilla never received this letter, because the Grey Cardinal intercepted it in September of 1997, and he ordered it destroyed. He did not know that a duplicate existed. He did not know that Diana had entrusted a second copy to me, sealed, with instructions never to open it until the day the Grey Cardinal moved against William and Harry, the same way he had moved against her. The Ninth Earl's voice hardened. 3 nights ago, he said. He did exactly that. The library seemed to contract around him. 20 million viewers leaned forward as one. The producer, Alistair Gray, had gone completely still behind the cameras, his hand pressed against his mouth. And Charles Spencer, 9th Earl Spencer, brother of the Princess of Wales, guardian of the Spencer swallow crest that had been the childhood symbol of Diana's pure and unbroken truth, laid the letter down and began to speak of what had happened 72 hours earlier, the catastrophic event that had finally forced his hand. Another memory rose. Christmas of 1988. Diana had been at Althorpe with the boys. William only 6 years old. Harry a small tumble of red hair and mischief at 4. They had been in this very library. The fire roaring. The scent of pine and cinnamon heavy in the air. Diana had knelt on the Persian rug beside her sons, and she had drawn the Spencer swallow on a piece of paper, the ancient family crest, wings spread, in flight. "This is our swallow," she had told the boys, her voice soft. "Swallows always come home. No matter how far they fly. No matter what tries to stop them. They always come home. And so will I. If anything ever happens, if anyone ever tells you your mother has gone away, you look for the swallow. And you will know I am still with you." William had traced the swallow with his small finger. Harry had asked if he could keep the drawing. Diana had folded it carefully and tucked it into Harry's pocket. And that drawing, Charles Spencer knew, still existed. Harry still had it. It had traveled with him to Eton, to Sandhurst, to Afghanistan, to California. It was the last physical thing his mother had ever given him with her own hands. 3 nights ago, that drawing had been stolen. The break-in at Harry's Montecito residence had been reported in the American press as a minor incident, a broken window, a rifled study, nothing of financial value taken. But Charles Spencer knew what had been taken. He knew because Harry had called him within the hour, distraught, describing in fragmented sentences the specific item missing from the false bottom drawer of his desk. The swallow drawing. Nothing else. Only that. And Charles Spencer had known, in that instant, that the Grey Cardinal had made his move. That the message had been delivered. That the same machinery which had crushed his sister was now turning its full attention upon her sons. And the condition Diana had set, the condition upon which this letter was to be opened and read to the world, had finally been met. The 9th Earl's voice was iron now, forged in 27 years of grief and rage. "He should not have taken the swallow," he said quietly. "He should have taken anything else. But he took the swallow. And by taking the swallow, he told the world that he intends to do to William and Harry what he did to their mother. And I will not allow it." He lifted his eyes to the camera. "I will not allow it. Somewhere in the palace, in a certain corner office overlooking a certain courtyard. A certain man in a charcoal suit was watching this broadcast on a certain monitor, and though his face had, for over 4 decades, remained an unreadable mask of gray composure, in this moment, the color drained from it entirely. His clipboard slipped from his fingers and struck the polished floor with a small, sharp sound. He was cornered. He was named. He was exposed. And across the United Kingdom, across the Commonwealth, the machinery of institutional silence began to break. The antique rotary telephone on the mahogany desk rang a second time. Charles Spencer lifted the receiver, his hand steadier now. This time the voice on the other end was Harry's. And Harry was already on a plane. He had boarded a private flight from Los Angeles the moment the broadcast had begun. He was somewhere over the Atlantic now, 20,000 feet above the Black Ocean, and his voice, that voice which had grown from the small red-haired boy in the library to a man who had known war and exile and a mother's absence, was steady and cold and dangerous. "Uncle Charles," Harry said. "I'm coming home. Tell William I'm coming home. And tell him we finish this together. For her." The line went dead a second time. The Ninth Earl set the receiver down. He drew a long breath. And he lifted the third and final page of Diana's letter. The final page was shorter than the others. It was not addressed to Camilla, or to William, or to Harry, or to Charles Spencer. It was addressed, in Diana's looping blue ink, to the Grey Cardinal himself. And it read as follows: "You once told me that the institution had survived kings who lost their heads. You told me it would certainly survive a woman who forgot her place. I have thought about your words every day since you spoke them to me in September of 1992, and I have come to understand something you never anticipated. The institution has indeed survived kings who lost their heads, but it has never survived a mother who refused to lose her sons. If you are reading this letter, then I am gone, and my brother has delivered it, and the world knows your name, or at the very least, knows your role. You spent your career believing that shadows would protect you. You were wrong. Shadows do not protect. Shadows are simply the places where truth waits to be found. And I have made certain, from beyond whatever grave you consigned me to, that the truth will find you. Yours in the certainty of justice, Diana." Charles Spencer laid the letter down. The library was silent. The grandfather clock ticked. The fire crackled low in the marble hearth. And the Ninth Earl looked at the camera, and he said, very quietly, "That is all. That is what my sister wanted the world to know. And now the world knows it." The producer, Alistair Gray, wiped his eyes. The encrypted feed held steady. 20 million screens across the United Kingdom, across Europe, across the Atlantic and the Pacific, and every quiet living room in every quiet town across the Commonwealth held the image of the Ninth Earl standing behind his mahogany desk, the cream-colored letter, and the yellowed cassette, and the crimson wax seal spread before him on the black velvet, the Van Dyck portrait watching from above, the pale November light softening at last through the mullioned windows. Buckingham Palace issued no statement. Clarence House issued no statement. Kensington Palace issued no statement. The silence from the institution was total. The silence was, in its way, the loudest response possible, because the machinery that had spent 40 years crushing the truth had, at last, no answer for the truth spoken plainly in an aristocratic library on a cold November morning by a brother who had waited 27 years to speak. Within an hour of the broadcast's end, the Metropolitan Police confirmed that a senior civil servant attached to the royal household had been suspended from his duties pending an internal review. His name was not released, but every journalist in Fleet Street already knew who he was. The Grey Cardinal had at last been dragged from the shadows into the pitiless light of public scrutiny. And though the machinery of the palace would surely try, in the days and weeks to come, to protect him, to insulate him, to spin his role and minimize his complicity, the letter existed. The cassette existed. The forensic authentication existed. The voices of Diana and Camilla, speaking together in that Gloucestershire drawing room in April of 1995, existed. The evidence was in the world now. And it could not be recalled. Camilla, Queen Consort, received a private courier at Clarence House later that same afternoon. The courier delivered a single item, a photocopy of Diana's letter, exactly as it had been read on the broadcast, with the third page addressed to the Grey Cardinal included. Camilla read the letter alone in her private sitting room, the winter light fading through the tall sash windows. She read it once, she read it a second time, and when she had finished, she folded it carefully, placed it in the drawer of her writing desk, and she wept not the tears of a queen, not the tears of a wife, but the tears of a woman who had, for 30 years, believed herself to have been Diana's rival, and who had learned, at last, that she had in truth been Diana's sister in suffering. She lifted the telephone. She called William. She called Harry. She told them both, in a voice trembling with something she had not permitted herself to feel in decades, that she would honor Diana's request, that she would protect them, that she would use every ounce of the position she now held to shield them from the machinery that had destroyed their mother, and that she was sorry profoundly, unspeakably sorry that she had not known sooner. At Althorpe, Charles Spencer walked out into the cold November evening after the cameras had been packed away and the crew had departed. The grounds were silver with frost. The great oaks stood black against a sky flushed with the last pale rose of sunset. He walked, alone, to the small island in the ornamental lake, the island where his sister had been laid to rest 27 years earlier, in the earth of the estate that had raised her. He knelt beside her grave. He laid the cream-colored envelope, now emptied of its terrible cargo, upon the frost-covered stone, and he whispered, so quietly that only she could have heard him, "It is done. Diana, I have kept my promise. The world knows. Your boys are safe. And the swallow has finally flown free." A single tear tracked down his cheek and fell upon the stone. Somewhere overhead, in the dying light, a small dark bird cut across the pink and gray sky in a single arcing flight. A swallow, impossibly, in November, when all swallows should have long since departed for warmer skies. Charles Spencer watched it until it vanished. And then he rose, and he walked back to the great house, and he closed the library door behind him. Across the United Kingdom, in 20 million living rooms, the broadcast cut to black. There was no music. There was no commentary. There was no closing voiceover. There was only a single, final, declarative sentence, appearing in plain white text upon the black screen, held for exactly 10 seconds before the transmission ended. "The truth has saved her boys." And then the screens went dark, and the nation sat in stunned, unbroken silence. And somewhere in a certain corner office, overlooking a certain courtyard within the walls of Buckingham Palace, a certain man in a charcoal suit sat with his empty hands upon his empty desk, and understood, at last, that the swallow had come home. The days that followed were unlike any the House of Windsor had endured in living memory. Newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic ran the story on their front pages for 11 consecutive mornings. The BBC devoted 3 separate primetime documentaries to the forensic authentication of the cassette recording. Independent audio analysts, retained by outlets from the Times to Le Monde to the New York Times, confirmed and reconfirmed the voice prints, the magnetic decay patterns, the ambient acoustic signatures, consistent with a small Gloucestershire drawing room in April of 1995. The Grey Cardinal, though never named on air, was named exhaustively in the tabloid press, in podcast investigations, in parliamentary questions raised with careful legal phrasing from the backbenches of the House of Commons. His 40-year career of quiet, ruthless institutional service was dissected in painful detail. Former colleagues, released at last from the fear of his shadow, came forward with accounts of meetings, of memoranda, of decisions made in windowless rooms that had shaped the fates of princesses and princes alike. The picture that emerged was more terrifying, more calculated, more sinister than even Diana had known. William met Harry at a small private airfield in Berkshire on the 4th morning after the broadcast. The two brothers, estranged for years by wounds the world had believed permanent, embraced on the tarmac in the cold dawn light without a single word passing between them. There were photographs grainy, taken from a distance, but unmistakable. William's hand pressed against the back of Harry's neck, Harry's face buried in his brother's shoulder. 2 men, in their 40s now, who had been small boys walking behind a coffin in the September of 1997, finding one another again in the shadow of their mother's final posthumous gift. What they said to one another in the car that drove them from the airfield to a private residence in the countryside was never reported. But those who saw them arrive said that both men were changed, that the old wariness was gone, that something forged in the fire of their mother's revelation had bound them once more into what they had always, in truth, been, her boys. Her swallows, come home at last. Camilla met with them both privately at a country estate away from the eyes of the press on the 6th day. What was said in that meeting has never been fully disclosed, and perhaps never will be. But it is known that Camilla wept. It is known that Harry, who had for so long carried a bitterness toward his stepmother that had calcified into something close to hatred, embraced her before he departed. It is known that William, ever the future king, ever the man who bore the weight of the crown upon shoulders that had first learned to bear grief at 15 years old, held Camilla's hand for a long moment and spoke to her, softly, 3 words that only she has ever heard. The Grey Cardinal formally resigned from his position on the 9th day. He issued no statement. He gave no interview. He simply vanished, as men of shadow do, into whatever quiet retirement had been arranged for him by the institution he had served for 4 decades. But he did not vanish into peace. Parliamentary inquiries were opened. Journalistic investigations continued. The Metropolitan Police, under pressure from every quarter of the political spectrum, announced a formal review of the security decisions made in the summer of 1997 concerning the Princess of Wales's protection detail. Whether that review would ever result in criminal charges remained, at the time of this account, an open question. But the machinery of accountability, which had for so long refused to touch him, had at last begun, slowly and inexorably, to close around him. At Althorpe, Charles Spencer resumed the quiet rhythms of his life. He walked the grounds. He tended the estate. He wrote in his study. He visited his sister's grave each evening at sunset. The cream-colored envelope, its purpose fulfilled, its wax seal broken, was placed within a small sealed reliquary of Spencer oak and buried beside Diana on the island in the ornamental lake, that it might rest with her for the remainder of time. The cassette, its forensic work complete, was donated to the British Library, sealed within its permanent archive under conditions of preservation that would ensure its survival for the next 500 years. And the swallow drawing, Harry's swallow, the small folded piece of paper that Diana had tucked into her 4-year-old son's pocket at Christmas of 1988, that drawing was recovered. It was recovered in the possession of an intermediary connected, through a chain of couriers, to the Grey Cardinal. It was returned to Harry within a fortnight of the broadcast, and Harry, upon receiving it, framed it in a small case of Spencer oak, and he hung it in the nursery of his own children, where his mother's promise that swallows always come home could watch over them every night as they slept. The final image of the affair, the one that would become iconic in the years to come, was captured by a single photographer on a cold November evening 2 weeks after the broadcast. It showed 3 figures walking together across the grounds of Althorpe. Charles Spencer in the center, William on his right, Harry on his left, moving toward the small island in the ornamental lake where their mother lay. They walked in silence. They carried no cameras, no advisors, no security. They walked simply as an uncle and his 2 nephews, as a brother and his sister's sons, as 3 men bound by a grief that had, at last, been transformed into something else. Something like justice. Something like peace. Something like the return of a bird that had been long presumed lost to the winter, but which had, against all expectation, against all the calculated cruelty of the men in gray, come home. The photograph would appear on the front page of every major newspaper the following morning. It bore no caption. It required none. The truth had saved her boys. The swallow had finally flown free. The secret was out. And in the vast, cavernous, hauntingly quiet library of Althorpe House, the fire in the marble hearth burned low. The Van Dyck portrait watched with its centuries of aristocratic composure. The grandfather clock ticked with the unhurried rhythm of a nation at last permitted to breathe, and the 9th Earl Spencer stood at the tall mullioned window, looking out across his ancestral grounds toward the small island in the ornamental lake, and he whispered, one final time, into the silence that his sister had left behind, "Rest now, Diana, rest at last." And she did.